Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if your brain power actually changes how you vote, or if your strong beliefs are what really call the shots? This is a fascinating question that touches on how we make big decisions, especially when the stakes are high, like in a presidential election. We're diving into a new study that looked at cognitive ability, which is basically your thinking power, and how it interacts with our deeply held beliefs, our ideology when we decide who to vote for. Does being smarter automatically make you vote one way or another? Or do your existing political views steer your thinking so much that your raw brain power doesn't matter as much? The researchers in this study wanted to answer a really specific question. Does your cognitive ability, your ability to think and reason, predict who you vote for in the same way for everyone? Or does it depend on how strong your political beliefs, your ideology are? They were particularly interested in the 2024 US presidential election, which they describe as a time of high misinformation and deep political division. Now, we know from other studies that cognitive ability can be linked to voting choices. Generally, people with lower cognitive ability have sometimes been found to support candidates like Donald Trump. This makes sense on one level because voting involves understanding complex issues, and higher cognitive ability might help with that. But here is where it gets interesting. Voting isn't just about how much brain power you have. It is also about what you believe, your values, your ideology. Things like right-wing authoritarianism, which is about valuing strong authority and tradition, and social dominance orientation, which is about believing some groups should be in charge of others, are powerful predictors of how people vote. These ideological leanings can sometimes have even bigger effects than cognitive ability. The big gap in past research was this. Scientists knew that cognitive ability and ideology both played a role, but they didn't really know if ideology changed how cognitive ability worked when it came to voting. Did having strong beliefs make your thinking power less important in deciding who to vote for? The researchers thought about this using a concept called motivated cognition. This idea comes from how our brains work, suggesting we have two ways of thinking: a quick, intuitive way, and a slower, more reflective way. Motivated cognition suggests that when our beliefs are really strong, we tend to use our thinking power, our reflective mind, not to find the objective truth, but to defend our existing beliefs. It is like our brain becomes a lawyer for our own ideas rather than a neutral judge. So, the theory is that if you have strong ideological commitments, you might not evaluate political information fairly. Instead, you might look for things that confirm what you already believe and dismiss anything that challenges your worldview. Your cognitive ability would then be used to justify your existing views, not necessarily to make the most accurate decision. For people with weaker ideological ties, their cognitive ability might be used more neutrally to evaluate information. The researchers also considered that maybe people just aren't always reasoning carefully, regardless of their beliefs. But the motivated cognition theory predicts that the connection between cognitive ability and vote choice should get weaker as ideological commitment gets stronger. To test this, the researchers designed a really thorough study for the 2024 US presidential election. First, they made sure to use a broad measure of cognitive ability, not just one narrow test. They included fluid reasoning, which is like problem solving with new information, and complex problem solving, which is about managing complicated systems. They also didn't just look at one type of ideology. They measured 5 different kinds: right-wing authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, social conservatism, economic conservatism, and how people place themselves on the political spectrum from liberal to conservative. This was important because different types of ideology might interact with cognitive ability differently. Crucially, this was a longitudinal study. That means they measured cognitive ability and ideology before the election. Then, after the election, they asked people who they voted for. This helps ensure that their ideology and thinking abilities were influencing their vote, and not the other way around. They used a fancy statistical method called local structural equation modeling, or LSE. Don't worry too much about the name, but the idea is really neat. Instead of just splitting people into high ideology and low ideology groups, which can be a bit arbitrary, LSM looks at how the relationship between cognitive ability and voting changes gradually across the entire range of ideological commitment. It is like a continuous spotlight that moves across the spectrum of beliefs. First, let's look at the basic findings, like what they found before even getting into the moderation part. As expected, they found that lower cognitive ability was associated with voting for Trump. They also found that stronger right-wing ideological orientations across all the measures they used were linked to voting for Trump. These results basically replicated what other studies have found for previous elections. But the really groundbreaking finding comes when we look at how ideology moderates or changes this relationship. This figure really tells the story. What they found was a clear pattern across 4 out of the 5 ideology measures. The negative association between cognitive ability and voting for Trump was strong among liberal and moderate voters. That is, among people with liberal or moderate views, higher cognitive ability was linked to voting for Harris. But here is the crucial part. As you move towards the conservative end of the spectrum, this association between cognitive ability and vote choice faded. For people with strong right-wing commitments, cognitive ability no longer seemed to predict their vote choice. It basically dropped to near zero. So, higher cognitive ability helped liberal and moderate voters distinguish between candidates, but it didn't seem to do that for the most ideologically committed conservative voters. Their votes were still different, but cognitive ability wasn't the deciding factor for them anymore. This finding strongly supports the motivated cognition idea. It suggests that when people have very strong ideological beliefs, they might be using their thinking abilities not for objective evaluation, but to defend their existing views. Their ideology becomes so dominant that it overrides the predictive power of their cognitive ability on their vote choice. The researchers highlight that this is a really important qualification to our understanding of how people vote. It is not a simple story of smarter people vote this way. Instead, it suggests that the electoral landscape is more complex. For some voters, their thinking power matters, but for others, especially those with strong ideological commitments, their beliefs are the primary driver, and cognitive ability plays a much smaller role, if any, in their electoral decisions. Now, like all good research, this study has some limitations. First, the sample was young adults recruited online, so it might not perfectly represent all voters, especially older or more ideologically settled individuals. Second, they focused only on voters for the 2 major party candidates. We don't know from this study how cognitive ability and ideology affect people who vote third party or don't vote at all. Another important point is that 4 out of the 5 ideology measures used were based on right-wing content. They didn't have a measure for strong left-wing commitment. While they did find something interesting with their political self-placement measure, showing the association was strongest among very liberal voters, they acknowledge that we don't definitively know if the same fading effect happens for strongly committed left-wing voters. Finally, this study shows a pattern, a correlation. It is consistent with motivated cognition, but it doesn't directly prove that people are intentionally using their thinking to defend beliefs. We're observing the outcome, not the precise internal thought process. So, what is the big takeaway from all this? This study has shown us that cognitive ability does matter for vote choice, but its influence isn't equal for everyone. For the 2024 US presidential election, lower cognitive ability was linked to voting for Trump, and stronger right-wing ideology was also linked to voting for Trump. But the truly novel finding is that this cognitive ability link weakened and practically disappeared for voters with the strongest right-wing commitments. It's like when your beliefs become a fortress, your reasoning power struggles to find a way in or out. This challenges the idea that everyone uses their thinking ability in the same way when making political decisions. And it adds a really important layer to our understanding of voter behavior, suggesting that ideology can sometimes steer the ship more powerfully than raw cognitive horsepower. What do you all think about these findings? Does this align with what you've observed in politics or your own thinking? Let me know in the comments below if you found this breakdown helpful. Please give it a like, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more deep dives into the fascinating world of psychology research. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.